First, can you tell me your name?
Sure, Pete Vreeland.
All right. Now, tell me about this documentary. What was the name of it?
So this documentary was called Conspiracy Theory. It was put out on Fox Television. And I want to say I ran across it maybe 8-10 years ago. It was re-aired, and that's when I saw it, because during the original airing, my brother-in-law saw it. He told me about it. But it was something I'd never really heard of before, and that was the idea that we'd faked the moon landing. And they were serious. I heard jokes and things like that, but these were people who legitimately felt that we didn't land on the moon. And they went through a series of evidence-based reasoning examples from the missions to show how there was another explanation. There was one that implied that we could do it in a desert instead of on the moon and things like that.
Now, you said you heard about this from your cousin or your
brother-in-law?
Your brother-in-law.
So. And he was rather convinced. Now, he was kind of goofy, so it was easy to convince him. And but yeah, he told me about it. He's like, oh yeah, the flag was fluttering and there was no wind on the moon, so how come the flag was fluttering? And there was only one light source, and that was the sun, so how come you had multiple shadows? Yeah. And I'm kind of thinking, well, there's already explanations for this to explain it, but he was easily convinced. So I managed to kind of catch it on that replay and record it and then be able to watch it for myself.
Yeah. And do you remember any notable experts that they brought on to explain what was going on?
The experts were what was his name? It was Bill something, and he was presented as an engineer from Rocketdyne.
Right.
So NASA, of course, hired hundreds of companies to help build this rocket. So he could have easily been there. It turns out, though, that when you look into his background, while he did work for Rocketdyne, he was actually a librarian,
right.
not an engineer. So, and the other gentleman they brought on was a physicist who had it in his head that we never landed on the moon. And those two were the main presenters. They did have a guy from NASA to, quote unquote, balance it out.
Yeah.
But they never, if you watch the tape, they never let him explain. He said there are reasons to explain this away, like what you're seeing is not true because, and then they never let him get to the because.
Right.
So it was it was meant to be objective, but it was pretty one-sided.
Not very objective.
Yeah.
Not very objective. Okay. So can you just run me by your reasons for showing this at the school or
Yep. So for me, it was a great opportunity to kind of get people to look at kind of just evidence-based reasoning. So I thought, if they saw it, it was very effective.
Yeah.
It was very persuasive. It was well crafted in that regard. So I thought, hey, we can see this, and then when we talk about it, they'll kind of know what it was like to kind of be duped by the video. Because once we talked about it, they'd see, oh, of course it was wrong.
Right.
That was the plan.
And how many people do you think walked away sort of convinced that we would never land on the moon?
Probably about 10 people. So in a class of 20, probably about half of them were too persuaded. The conspiracy theory video was, despite I didn't agree with the message, their techniques, their approach, top notch.
Yeah,
they really
style over substance, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
They never had Buzz Aldrin, of course, one of the people who would have been one of the people who landed on the moon.
Yeah.
Now Neil Armstrong, notorious for not giving interviews to anybody, so no surprise there.
Yeah.
But the best they could do is find this one representative from NASA to talk about it, and like I said, they let him say, no, that's not true, and then when the because came, they cut him off. So, but it wasn't obvious, it was that well blended that it wasn't clear that they were cutting him off, but when you stop and you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it's wait, they switched to the other person, or they went to a commercial, or so, but yes, about 10 people,
Now, I remember you gave a very simple explanation for why we landed on the moon and how we have evidence of that. Could you just tell me again, or tell for the audience?
For the audience, yeah. So, in the end, when you look at the photographic evidence and all that and things like that, the thing that really stands out in my head is it wasn't a simple expedition. This was the space race.
Yeah.
We were competing against an enemy, the Soviet Union.
USSR.
The USSR at the time, yeah. So they were very closely watching us. We were very closely watching them. We were building up nuclear missiles. We were aimed at each other. I mean, this is the beginning, the heart of the Cold War. The Soviets were trying to achieve the same exact thing. And they had all the same technology we did. They could listen and they could tell if a radio signal was coming from the desert or it was coming from the moon. Yeah. They knew that. So what is the likelihood that our kind of mortal enemy at the time would know that we cheated and not say anything?
Yeah.
And so for me, the real evidence, aside from the fact that they left pieces on there that reflect light and lasers, and you can actually, they still do that today. They aim a laser at it, reflects back, and they time it, and they know something about how far the moon is from the Earth. So astronomers are on board from every nation, because it's not just, if you can see the moon, you can see these reflectors. So anybody can test at any time to see if it's there, and sure they have. But in the heat of that battle, the Soviets had won every other thing.
First achievement, yeah.
First satellite, first man in space, first woman in space, first rendezvous in space. Everything was a Soviet first. Yeah. And yet we come along and say, but we were the first to actually land on the moon. The Soviets wouldn't have stood for that had it not been true. And the other part too is the Rocketdyne and all these other companies, you would had about 500,000 people in on the conspiracy. Yeah. So 500,000 people stayed silent. And the other part to it, keep in mind the Earth is not, the U.S. is not always aimed at the moon. Right. And actually when we landed, the signals coming from Neil Armstrong were actually passing through Australia. Australia received it and then sent it to us. So Australia would have had to been on it too. So when you add up all the likelihood of all those people working on a conspiracy of substance and the Soviet Union turning a blind eye to it, the math doesn't add up. Yeah. So I know we landed on the moon.
It's hard. It's becoming harder and harder to convince people that we did actually land on the moon. Yeah. Because just with the amount of feedback loops that appear in society now through technology, it's very hard to actually get into those groups and say, "Hey guys, why don't you guys just sit down and listen for a second?"
Oh yeah, and it's because you can pursue the answer you want online.
Yeah. If
you want us to land on the moon, you go to one website. If you didn't want us to, go to the other. And then when you get the recommendations from those websites, YouTube's actually particularly bad about this. Yes. It'll if you're just experimenting to find out, you don't know, so you're testing the water. What do both sides have to say? Yeah. When you start to see the recommended on each side, they pull you further and further, more radical. And then the next video suggested is even more radical, and you can get so caught up in it, lose your way, and begin to believe almost anything.
You can go from the moon landing to 9/11 to JFK, and in some very extreme cases, you can go to sort of the Holocaust denial.
Exactly.
Very egregious things.
Yeah.
Now, as a quick aside, did you ever hear anything about or have you ever heard the story of the U.S. and the Soviet Union perhaps working together to get people to the moon? Have you ever heard about that?
So in terms of that, so I had, aside from what I know about space policy, early on in the space race, it did have a different feel than the arms race, the Cold War, because several treaties had been signed so that if a American astronaut had to emergency land in the Soviet Union, he would be captured as a spy. Right. And reciprocation for the U.S. So if a cosmonaut had landed in Indiana, he's not a spy. We'll
send him back.
Because keep in mind, in the early '60s, we did have spy planes shot down in the Soviet Union, and the pilots captured and held as spies. Yes. So in terms of that type of cooperation, but in terms of actually agreeing to do it together, those substantive agreements and the results of those didn't happen until much later. As a matter of fact, right now, the International Space Station, astronauts arrive via Soviet rocket. Yeah. And there are some American rockets that use Soviet engines, well, now Russian. Yes. Russian engines. But yeah, so there is some level of degree of cooperation. As a matter of fact, many with the International Space Station, cosmonauts spend time in the U.S., astronauts spend time in Russia. As a matter of fact, some cosmonauts learn English, some astronauts learn Russian, and they develop friendships that kind of transcend the fact that we are somehow politically not aligned.
Yes.
So, but yeah, very much it's, in a sense, it's a model that unfortunately, they should follow politically, but they don't. Because it is, when you read astronauts' memoirs about their time in the Soviet Union, very, very comfortable, very pleasant experience for them. And then the same thing from the Russian time, the cosmonauts.
Spending time in it.
Exactly, spending time.
Yeah.
So it's, in a sense, it's a shame that we can't build on that.
Yeah.
But so that's in terms of them working together, not so much during the space race. It was too much was on the line.
That seemed a little bit conspiracy to me when I read about it 2 nights ago. I was like, wait a second, that's a little fishy. I don't think that would have conspired until later. But now, of course, I have to ask you about a couple more things. But what is your knowledge about Star Wars program implemented by?
During the the Star Wars program was an attempt in the 1980s to blunt the Soviet half of the Cold War. So at the time, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear missiles that if you attacked us, we would attack you in such a way that even if I could stop 90% of the Soviet missiles, the 10% that got through could end civilization. Yeah. And the same thing on the other side. So it was kind of this sense that there was a balance to it. So the reason we're not going to launch a war against you is because we know you're going to launch a war against us.
Right.
So the concept is studied politically is mutually assured destruction. Mm-hmm. So MAD is the acronym for that. The Star Wars was an attempt to shift the table a bit to kind of say, we can't take out 90%, we can take out 100%. Yeah. So it was our attempt to disturb that balance, because then all of a sudden we'd be on top because we could attack them without fear of retaliation or effective retaliation, because although you launch your missiles, our space program will take out those missiles and they'll never see a soil. So politically that made it very unstable, and that's why the Soviet Union was up in arms about it, because it's essentially like showing up to a knife fight with a gun. Right. And,
not a great idea.
Yeah, we said this was a knife fight. What are you doing with a gun? And so you said this is a nuclear arms race. What are you doing with something that disables our nuclear missiles? And by destroying them. But a lot of questions about its ultimate effectiveness, because it was the 80s, and like you're generally talking like Star Wars, like lasers and stuff.
Yeah, lasers get a little impractical.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think that's. Well, I was watching Interstellar. We were watching it in Mr. Mont's class. Yes. And I remember the teacher said, or you've seen the movie, right?
Yes.
The teacher in the beginning says something about it was some sort of strange measuring contest where they were trying to bankrupt each nation through space travel. Yeah. Which seemed very, very impractical.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I mean, it is impractical, but that's essentially how we won the Cold War.
I've heard that compared to the Star Wars program, and to like
you outspend them.
Outspend them.
Yeah. There was actually, if you studied this stuff at the time, I forget his name, but he wrote, it was a political analysis of the events, and he essentially wrote that be ready to support the black bear when he stumbles, or the red bear when he stumbles, because the red bear is a reference to the Soviet Union. And sure enough, when they went broke, they really went broke. Yeah. And we had to make sure that they didn't disappear as a power, because
that would throw off the balance of
Europe and
exactly, the world.
Yeah, there was just it's too much at stake. So it's kind of like when you win a war, you don't totally disarm your enemy.
Yeah.
So, but so that was essentially it was, and we managed to outspend them, and that effectively brought the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
So, and ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the fall of the Iron Curtain, and then Eastern Europe, and 1,000 other things.
Yeah. Well, I think that's everything that I got through. But I wanted to ask if you'd ever seen a documentary. It's called Operation Avalanche.
No.
It's not about how we faked the moon landing. It's about how 2 guys decided they were going to fake the moon landing, and they got the rest of the government to go along with it. If you ever get the chance, on like
Operation Avalanche.
Operation Avalanche. It's a comedy. It's one of the funniest movies I've seen in the past 2 years.
Have you seen Alien Autopsy?
No, I haven't.
It's the same thing.
Is it?
But so Fox, I don't know if Fox is at the center of this, but Fox aired a video, Alien Autopsy, that was supposedly recovered from Roswell kind of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously it was like,
fake.
It was fake,
yeah,
right?
Of course.
So anyway, Alien Autopsy is about how they made that video. and it's probably the same thing as Operation Avalanche because essentially it was in England, and like they didn't know where to film it, so this one guy's sister went out of town, and they used her flat, and they're all in there, and she came back early, and he's like. But if you're familiar with the original film, it shouldn't be too hard to find like the original Alien Autopsy video. They did it spot on. So like they made that corner of the flat look like that room. Because if you watch it,
like a sterilized white container.
Exactly, the table and even the alien they made it look the same. But it was just so funny, and like I forget how, because the guy showed it to them. But then it got destroyed after they sold it, and the guy who wanted it was going to kill them now, because he was this weird eccentric who really wanted the film, and so they ended up faking it.
Yeah.
Based on so it was one of these things.
Yeah.
So is it a fake if we saw the original and we made the fake look just like the original?
Right.
So but it's got that British humor. It's
great.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah. I think that's everything.
Yeah, check it out because it's good stuff. Because MythBusters did that episode.